I forgot to cut that off.
Cheat sheet.
Yeah. Robbie can't make me laugh if I don't cut it
I
on.
got one of those. I was talking about bringing one.
All right. Everybody hear me now? Everybody hear me now? All right. Let's see here. I had a good men's fellowship this past Monday. Daughters of the King Bible study. I come up here, I guess it was Tuesday night, and the parking lot was pretty full for that, so good time there. Let's see, we got children's choir going on tonight, youth ministry going on tonight. Got some chair fitness and refit on Thursday. And then on Saturday, kicking off our Young Inspirations meeting, our first meeting of the year. Looking forward to that. Also had Morning Mercies this morning. Good group of ladies here for that. So a lot going on at our church. It is good. It's always good to see these facilities get used other than just Sundays and Wednesdays. So, we spend a lot of money on these facilities and pay a lot of money to heat and cool them. It's a shame for them to sit empty throughout the rest of the week. So it's good to see all those studies and those things going on. So let's start off with a little bit of a review. So anybody have anything from chapter 13, what we looked at last week? Anybody? John Mark kind of took off on his own, right? He left Paul and Barnabas there. Luke said that he departed. Paul would later say that he deserted them. But later we read from Paul in Colossians there that they reconciled their differences, whatever they were. Don't know why Mark left. There was a lot of speculation there. Ministry can be difficult, and it can be stressful and intimidating. So certainly we need to keep our missionaries and those who serve in our prayers. I did mention last week how it was interesting that they stood against Bar Jesus, right? But then disunity amongst the three there called them to divide. We got to make sure that as a church we are standing against Satan, right? Standing against the principalities and the powers and spiritual wickedness in high places, that we don't turn on each other, right? But we stand against Satan. And I even said last week, it's not a us versus them. It's not a us versus the culture and the community around them. We should desire to see them come to know Christ there. Paul preached a sermon there. What did he preach? I broke the sermon down into 3 parts. Can anybody give me any one of those 3 parts? They don't necessarily have to be in order.
Israel's history.
Okay, he gave Israel's history, right, from the beginning until John the Baptist, right? And even quoted John the Baptist saying, there's one coming whose sandals I'm not even worthy to unloose. So he kind of gave them a history there. What was the second part? Suze gave us the first part. What was the second part? It's the heart of the gospel, right? Right? What did he remind them about Jesus? That he was the Messiah, right? That they had rejected him, that they had crucified him. They crucified an innocent man, is what he tells them. You crucified an innocent man. But God raised him up from the dead, right? And he was seen by many witnesses, right? I forget what the count is, but I know there was over 500 at one time. So he talked about the rejection of Christ, the crucifixion, the resurrection. Third part. That was sort of the application, right? That was the invitation, the challenge to respond. Paul said in verse 39 that by belief in him, everyone who believes is justified from all things which could not be justified by the law. Right? He said, listen, he goes, through faith in Christ, you can be justified, right? And we talked a little bit about what being justified means, right? God doesn't see us, right? It's not just as if I never sinned, right? God doesn't see us. He sees the Son, right? He sees the blood of His precious Son, Jesus, right? We are declared righteous, justified, a judicial term. We are declared righteous. Not that we are righteous, but we're declared righteous because of our faith in Jesus Christ, right? Because of the Son that was crucified on the cross there. But because we have been declared righteous, we should what? We should act like it. We should what? Be righteous. Because we've been declared righteous, we should live as if we are righteous. The Jews did not respond appropriately to Paul's message, but what? The Gentiles did. The Gentiles did believe. So, Lord willing, tonight we're going to cover chapter 14. So y'all just pray that my voice holds out tonight. If not, we'll just have some of you read. I've thought about doing that anyway. Have some other people read, especially when you got long passages like this that we're looking at. So, but Acts chapter 14, beginning in verse 1. Now it happened in Iconium that they went together to the synagogue of the Jews and so spoke that a great multitude, both of Jews and Greeks, believed. All right, this was the common practice, right? Paul's common practice. When he went into a city there, he first went into the synagogue, and that's what they did here. And it says that both Jews and Greeks believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brethren, poisoned their minds against Paul and Barnabas. Therefore they stayed there a long time, speaking boldly in the Lord, who was bearing witness to the word of His grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. So Paul and Barnabas were doing what? They were doing miracles, right? But the multitude of the city was divided. Part sided with the Jews and part with the apostles. And when the violent attempt was made by both the Gentiles and him aware of it, and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonium, so to the surrounding region. So after leaving Pisidia, Antioch, Paul traveled there approximately 90 miles there, southwest to Iconium. Iconium was a Greek city, so it would have been greatly influenced by the Greeks. Paul did as he always did, arriving in a new city, began preaching to the Gentiles, and it says that, or preaching to the Jews, and some Jews believed, as opposed to what had happened earlier when the Jews didn't respond, but the Gentiles did. Here we have both Jews and Greeks responding, but there were some that rejected Christ and provoked the crowds to violence, to anger. Although Paul and Barnabas were performing miracles, doing signs and wonders, these angered crowds decided that they were going to try to stone Paul and Barnabas. The Romans, we talked a little bit about that. Sergius Paulus, who was kind of the governor for the Romans there, we talked a little bit about that a couple of weeks ago, how they had these governors that would be over the conquered lands, the Romans would, but then they would, for the most part, allow the people to sort of govern themselves, okay? And they did do this. The Romans did do this, but one thing that they did not allow to be done without their sort of approval was capital punishment, so stoning, okay? So they decided they want to stone Paul and Barnabas, which would have been a big mess, because the Romans would have saw that as an illegal stoning without having an official Roman trial. So had they have followed through with what they desired to do, that would have maybe been some major issues for them. So you see these missionaries, Paul and Silas, they fled Iconium under the threat of being stoned and found themselves in Lystra and Derbe. Do you think that these missionaries were wrong to flee Iconium, to flee being stoned? Do you think they were wrong in doing that? Y'all are awful quiet. Certainly not. Certainly not. Paul and Barnabas would have not left that place unless the Spirit led them to lead that place. They would have been obedient to what God had for them to do. If these men fled, it was under the leading of God. We read in verse 19, or we will read here in verse 19 here in a little bit, that Paul was eventually what? He was stoned, right? He was stoned and they drug him out of the city, right? And we'll talk a little bit about how that played out. But according to church tradition, Paul was eventually beheaded in Rome under Nero. He was beheaded. Also, according to church tradition, Barnabas was stoned in Salamis. So once again, I don't think these men were fearful of being stoned. They weren't fearful of dying. They were being obedient to what God had called them to do. You know, no matter what God had for them, they trusted that God was working out His plan. And as we've said before, kind of the common theme going through Acts, no one can what? Help me out. No one can stop God's will. No one can stop what God is doing. God was growing His church, and nobody, Bar Jesus, the Jewish officials, these people that sought to stone Paul and Barnabas, no one can stop what God is doing. Okay, so that's all right. Next time I ask that question, all right, we're going to answer in unison. Okay. No one can stop what God is doing, okay? That's going to be the answer until we get through the book of Acts, okay? And maybe we'll have all grasped a hold of that before we get out of it. So let's continue reading there. Let's reread verse 6 again there. It says, they became aware of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding region, and they were preaching the gospel there. So once again, Paul goes into a new city. What does he do? He begins to preach the gospel. That's a good, you know what, that's a good way to live life. You know what I mean? Anytime you go into a new place, preach the gospel, right? Be a great thing for us to do, right? And in Lystra, a certain man without strength in his feet was sitting, a cripple from his mother's womb, and he had never walked. This man heard Paul speaking. Paul, observing him intently and seeing that he had faith to be healed, said with a loud voice, stand up straight on your feet. And he leaped and walked. Now when the people saw what Paul had done, they raised their voices, saying in the Lycaonian language, the gods have come down to us in the likeness of men. And Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. Then the priest of Zeus, whose temple was in front of their city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates, intending to sacrifice with the multitudes. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard this, they tore their clothes and ran in among the multitude, crying out and saying, men, why are you doing these things? We also are men with the same nature as you, and preach to you that you should turn from these useless things to the living God. So Paul and Barnabas, you know, they've already been doing these miracles and these wonders, right? They come here, and this man who is lame, Paul speaks to him and tells him to stand up and walk, and these people say, well, these are gods, right? These are gods that have come down into the appearance of men, and they began to try to offer sacrifices and worship Paul and Barnabas, and Paul and Barnabas, they ripped their clothes. They were in anguish and said, this is not right. Don't worship us, right? We are just men. It says here that we have come to preach to you that you should turn from these useless things to the living God. They were already involved in idolatry and worship of these Greek gods. This wasn't something new that just happened with Paul and Barnabas. They were already doing this. They already had temples set up for it. They had priests set up for it. There was idolatry there. And he said, we have come to preach to you that you should turn from these useless things, the worship of false gods, these dead gods that can do nothing for you, that if they ever live, they're dead now, and turn to the living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all the things that are in them, who is bygone generations allowed all nations to walk in their own ways. In other words, it's It's a similar reference to, ignorance God has allowed, you know what I mean? But now his son is arrived. We know the truth. You no longer get to walk in ignorance, right? Nevertheless, did he not leave himself without witness, talking about Jesus, in that he did good. He gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. And with these sayings, they could scarcely restrain the multitude from sacrificing to them. Then the Jews from Antioch and Iconium came there, and having persuaded the multitudes, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. However, when the disciples gathered around him, he rose up and went to the city, and the next day he departed with Barnabas to Derbe. So Paul took this ministry, the ministry of preaching the gospel, there to Lystra. Comes into Lystra there, comes across this man. Paul is looking at this man. He knows that this man needs to respond in faith. He trusts that he would. I'm sure God gave him that insight there. This man was hopeless, right? He had no hope of getting healed, right? He had no strength in his legs. From his birth, he had been a crippled, and probably assumed that pretty much his whole life he would just remain what? A cripple. But Paul, without even being asked by this man, healed this man, and it says that he leaped and he walked. This healing of Paul was instantaneous. He was completely healed. Okay, not like a lot of the garbage we see today. This was a miracle of God, and not that God doesn't do miracles today, but a lot of faith healings, things we see today, are not working of God. It's working of something else. But anyway, that's something for another story here. But they healed this man. The crowd, sawing this healing, reasoned that these two men were gods and tried to worship them. They thought they were these Greek gods come down to visit existence, and we know that Jesus was the person that brought these things. God, Jesus, it says that by him all things were created that were created, speaking of Jesus. The God that blessed all people with rain to testify to his existence and his goodness, yet the crowd still wanted to sacrifice to Paul and Barnabas. And it says there in verse 13, and with these sayings they could scarcely restrain the multitude from, they had to convince these people, listen, what you're doing is wrong. To offer sacrifices to us is wrong. They had to convince them this is not what you needed to be doing here. I think it's interesting, Paul and Barnabas, they run into trouble earlier, right? They ran into that guy Bar-Jesus, right? Trying to stand between them and the proconsul coming to faith. If they don't run into trouble, what happens? Trouble runs into them. Trouble tracks them down, right? So these disbelieving Jews, right, left from Antioch and Iconium and followed them to Lystra, right? Some days it just feels like that, right? No matter how fast you run, trouble's just right on your heels, right? Well, that's the situation. That's the life of Paul and Barnabas, the missionaries, right? So they stirred up the anger. So they stirred these Jews from Antioch and Iconium, the ones that didn't believe, stirred up the people to anger. People are fickle beings. You know that? Right? These same people that were trying to worship them as gods and offer sacrifices to them are now angered at them to the point that they stoned Paul. They got him this time, right? At least they think they got him, right? They stoned him, and they drug him out of the city thinking that he was dead. Was he dead? He got up and walked again. If he was dead, God raised him from the dead, right? They sure thought he was dead, right? They done stoned him and dragged his body outside the city and said, we don't want that rotten corpse in the city. We're going to leave it out here outside the city, right? I don't know if Paul was dead and God raised him. I don't know, but I know he got back up. They thought he was dead, but he wasn't dead, right? It just amazes me sometimes how things can change, how people can change, how popularities can change, right? One day you think everybody's your friend and your pal, and You make a stand for Christ and it don't feel like you got no friends, right? That's why we come to church, so we can be encouraged and strengthened by fellow believers. God's will for Paul at this time was to be stoned rather than worshipped. What do these events say about the trust Paul had in God? Complete trust? Yeah. Anybody else? He trusted God for who God is, right? His faith in God was not based upon his circumstances, right? They went from worshiping to stoning him, yet his faith was not based on the circumstances. We've got to be careful that our faith does not waver in the dark circumstances. That our faith does not waver in the valleys, as we used to sing about, maybe still do from time to time. That when difficulty comes, our faith is still in God. Last Monday night, the men, Brother Allen, we looked at Job, right, and how Job lost everything. He lost everything. You know, he lost all his cattle, he lost his servants, he lost his children, you know. But he still had faith in God. He still trusted God. He still worshiped God. Think about another one. As I was reading over my notes this evening, I thought about I had to go look it up because I couldn't remember his name. But Jim Elliot, the missionary, right, to the Indians there. I forget which Indians they were. But you know, and they went to that mission field, right, and died on that mission field, right. I think when I read his biography, if I remember correctly, it said when they came at them, they had weapons, and when they found their bodies, they had weapons that they could have used to defend themselves, but they chose not to. Jim Elliot and those with him said, "You know what, God, if it's your will for us to die here, then we will die here," right? Got to trust in God's plan. Not base our faith on the circumstances of life. How might a missionary respond if to being stoned if his trust in God was based on the circumstances God allowed in his life? Hey God, it wasn't too bad. They're trying to stone me now. You know what I mean? I'm done. You know what I mean? I'm walking away, right? I signed up for the good times, not the bad times, right? I'm glad that we don't have missionaries. Well, I'm sure we probably do have some missionaries like that, but I'm glad that the ones that I know don't have that perspective. We have some friends of ours. I won't say their name because we're online and we're not supposed to say things like that online. But we got some friends of ours. They were on the mission field in a closed country, and some of their fellow missionaries were murdered. And their mission agency pulled them off the mission field because they had lost a couple. And our friends, me and Melody's friends, were doing the best that they could to get back into another country that was closed to share the gospel. You know what I mean? You'd been spared one place, right? And trying to, what do they say, out of the frying pan into the fire, you know? So that's the heart that Paul and Barnabas had. That's the heart that a lot of missionaries had. That's the heart that we should have. We may not be missionaries, but as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, we all have a responsibility to share the gospel. We all have a ministry, right? God has called us all to make disciples, right? Let's continue reading there in verse 21. And when they had preached the gospel to that city and made many disciples, they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch. So what had they done? That's right. They made a big circle. You know what I mean? They went out and then they come back the way that they came there. It says, strengthening the souls of the disciples, exhorting them to continue in the faith, and saying, we must through many tribulations enter the kingdom of God. In other words, before we see righteousness, before we see heaven, we're going to face a lot of tribulations. So when they had appointed elders in every church and prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord in whom they had believed. And after they had passed through Pisidia, they came to Pamphylia. Now when they had preached the word in Perga, they went down to Attalia. From there they sailed to Antioch, where they had been commended to the grace of God for the work which they had completed. Now when they had come and gathered the church together, they reported all that God had done with them, and that he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. So they stayed there a long time with the disciples. So after leaving Lystra and Derbe, Paul and Barnabas backtracked through the regions of Galatia there, visiting the areas, visiting the churches that they had started through believers there, visiting the areas that they had ministered. So they came through and they preached the gospel. Right? And I'm sure they stuck around for a little while. They did some discipleship, did some teaching, but I get the impression they were kind of moving through. And now they're coming back through, and they are encouraging these new believers, these people that had accepted faith their first time through. They encourage them to continue in their faith. Now you got to remember, they tried to kill Paul and Silas in some of these places, right? I mean, these were not easy places for them. No matter how dangerous it was for them to go out of the frying pan into the fire, they went back through because they knew how it was important to strengthen these new believers, encourage them to continue in the faith, not only teaching them the truth, but encouraging them to be obedient, right? It's not enough that we know the truth, right? God calls us to live out the truth, to be obedient to the truth. They were encouraged that they needed to persevere, right? To persevere. When I read that, what popped into my mind was spiritual warfare, right? Spiritual warfare, right? How many days of our life are we in a spiritual battle? Every single day. If you roll out of bed in the morning and you profess to be a believer and you stand upon the truths of God's word, you will be in a spiritual battle every single day. And Paul encouraged these new believers, listen, the Christian life is not always roses. You know what I mean? It's difficult and it's challenging. And you need to persevere until we get to heaven. It says that they appointed elders to lead and shepherd the flock here. So they didn't lead these churches on their own. They found some godly men and discipled them. It says that they prayed and fasted. I can't help but think Paul and Barnabas prayed and fasted over who would be the elders of these churches and these groups of people there. And it says that they commended them to the Lord. Paul and Barnabas, what does that mean? They commended them to the Lord. Anybody got any thoughts? They dedicated them to the Lord? Anybody else? Anybody else? Awful quiet tonight. Bunch of teenagers. Ask questions and Bible's time to get quiet. Give them a moment of silence and they talk about everything. Commended them to the Lord. Paul and Barnabas said, God, we have been faithful to what you have called us to do. We have been faithful. We have saw these people accept Christ. We have discipled them. We have taught them. And now, Lord, it's up to you. Right? To take it from here. That's what we got to do. We got to do what God has for us to do and then leave the rest up to God. Right? Do what God has called us to do. Be faithful to what He has called us to do, regardless of the persecution, the difficulty. Be faithful to what God has called you to do, and then leave the results up to God. Leave the rest up to God. Not that God needs anything from us, but He has commanded us to serve and to minister. After they returned to their sending church in Antioch, they celebrated. Had big posters of Paul and Barnabas, had a parade with Paul and Barnabas on some chairs as they walked down through the city of Antioch, right? Celebrating what Paul and Barnabas did, right? No, they didn't celebrate what Paul and Barnabas did. They celebrated what God had done. That's what he said, right? Verse 27. Now when they had come and gathered the church together, they said, listen, you sent us out, right? You released us, right, to the work of God. And let us tell you what God has done. They reported all that God had done with them. What God had done with them. What God had done through them. But nonetheless, it was what God had done. Especially opening up the door of faith to the Gentiles. Despite being stoned and left for dead, what was Paul's focus? Evangelism, the gospel, discipleship. Evangelism and discipleship. What are we called to do? To evangelize and to disciple, right? In a world full of lost people, we live in a world full of lost people. Don't take long scroll on your social feed to figure that out, does it? We live in a world full of lost people. In a world full of lost people, we need to pray about what God would have our part to be in the Great Commission. Pray about what God would have us to do when it comes to discipleship and evangelism. God may not call you to the road to be a missionary. God, what is my role? What is my part? We should pray for our missionaries. Pray for their safety. Pray for their boldness to proclaim the gospel when it's a death sentence. Pray for their effectiveness in witnessing, to see souls saved, to see the harvest. Pray for our role in supporting missionaries, right? We do that here, right? The church as a whole, through individuals, you throw money in the offering plate and we use it to sponsor missionaries. But is that all that we're called to do? God may have called you to do something else. You know, they got these prayer letters up here. Sometimes they could use a little bit of something. Maybe you could help provide that little bit of something that they need there. Very least, you should pray for them, right? Pray for them. Send them a letter of encouragement. We talked about that too. Now, certainly some mission fields are closed, so you can't send them a letter like we can. But some of our missionaries are not in closed countries. You can send them a letter and encourage them, right? Missions is not easy. Ministry is not easy. Kim says amen, right? She didn't say that, but I knew she would, right? She was thinking it. I only say that because they were on the mission field, so they know what it's like. Write a letter of encouragement to our missionaries. Encourage them what they're doing, because so many just want to walk away. They just want to walk away. If it weren't for the calling of God on their lives, the ministry would be too difficult, I assure you. Right? I remember I had a professor in Bible college. He said, if you can do anything else, talking about ministry, if you can do anything else and be happy, do it. You know. But if God's called you to ministry or missions, you won't be able to be happy doing anything else. But it can be difficult. So we need to encourage our missionaries. So, anybody else? Anything else you want to say about anything that we've talked about tonight? Anything you want to add to it? Anybody? All right. Well, we'll get into our praise time. I didn't mean to dismiss everybody